For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Mutsabi Hoyani. Researcher and analyst Professor Raymond Suttner joins me for Suttner's View, a weekly commentary on South Africa's political scene. Thank you, Professor, for your time.
Thank you.
One other question that is likely to arise in the new parliament and current politics is the power of traditional leaders. What is your understanding of the relationship between tradition, custom, and the other aspects of the constitution?
This has always been a complex and controversial question. If you take democracy, in some ways there is an inevitable tension between electing people and people claiming the right to rule over others by virtue of heredity. I might say heredity, real or claimed, because in many cases the claim of some chiefs to be hereditary is contested by others, and during the apartheid era many chiefs were deposed because they were not compliant and others were put in their place. So the whole lineage, the line of succession of chiefs has been tampered with over the years. But the question of the role of chiefs, the role of custom in society has been an issue throughout the period after conquest of the African people, with the British and the Boer republics all pursuing distinct policies towards the conquered people. And it is claimed by some people that chiefs have always been part of the resistance. When in the 1980s Contralesa, the Congress of Traditional Leaders, was formed, they claimed that chiefs have always been part of resisting oppression. And if you look at the history, there is some truth in this, because the resistance to conquest, there were 100 years of warfare. There was 100 years of warfare on the eastern frontier amongst Xhosa-speaking people. There were decades of resistance amongst the Pedi. There was heroic resistance amongst the Zulu, and even amongst the Venda under the grandfather of Mpepu, who later became a Bantustan leader. There was a lot of resistance. So there was that history of resistance, but even in the formation of the African National Congress, called the South African Native National Congress in 1912, chiefs were involved, and chiefs had a special place in the origin of the ANC in what was called a House of Chiefs. And in the early days of the ANC, chiefs provided funding which assisted in the formation of the ANC's newspaper, Abantu Bato. They also helped fund the delegations that went to Britain in the early years after Union. But after a time, chiefs started to believe that the ANC was not really going to address their grievances. Now, what the ANC was doing was going to Britain and petitioning Britain to intervene. Now, the problems that they wanted intervention on related to the government, the white government in South Africa. And the chiefs came to believe that they were more likely to remedy problems that they had if they were themselves to form a closer relationship with the white government. Consequently, from the 1920s, or maybe a bit earlier, you can see that chiefs get more involved in the Native Administration Department, as it was then called, and gradually they started to become salaried officials of the government. And the government, in many cases, took steps more and more in later years to depose chiefs who were not meeting their needs. Now, the question of chiefs and how chiefs operate is also connected to how we relate to the concept tradition and the concept of custom and culture. And there are very many people who suggest that these are unchanging concepts. Like custom must mean immemorial custom. And they try to depict the chiefs and what used to be called native courts or Bantu Affairs Commissioners' Court as courts that apply custom which has existed from time immemorial. Now that's basically factually inaccurate, because in the period before conquest, the way in which custom was understood by people was not as something unchanging, but as a living custom. Now, one of the arguments that people in the rural areas have with the way in which customary law, or what purports to be customary law, is implemented today is that they say that custom is not rigid, frozen in time, that it is an evolving, changing custom to take account of, for example, you have women who head households, something that you didn't get in the pre-colonial society. In fact, a large percentage of households in South Africa, not a majority, but a large percentage, are headed by single women. So the way in which the government is relating to custom now is in some ways returning paradoxically to the way in which the apartheid regime used to treat it, to elevate the role of chiefs. Now, what is interesting is that this started in 1990 when the ANC was unbanned. At that time, after the 1980s, people had risen up against chiefs, and there was a lot of hostility to chiefs. But people like Mandela and Sisulu, when they came out of jail, believed that it was important to relate to the chiefs and to the leaders of Bantustans. The way they saw it is that they were about to enter into negotiations, and it was important to isolate the apartheid regime. And in doing this, they felt it was essential to find a constructive relationship with chiefs. Now, so it made people very unhappy, people who had only recently been fighting against chiefs, trying to depose chiefs because of what chiefs had done to communities. But there was this complex tension between the need to side with people who suffered injustice under chiefs, but on the other hand, to not to take steps to narrow the support base of the apartheid regime. So that is part of the complex background to dealing with the Constitution, which on the one hand is dedicated to accountability and elected leadership, but coexists with recognition of chiefs. So how do you recognize chiefs while also abiding by the Bill of Rights?
So the Traditional Courts Bill lapsed in the last session of Parliament. What do you see as the future of that and other legislation that has evoked considerable protest?
You know, the Traditional Courts Bill has been around for, I think it may first have been discussed in around 2003, but in 2008 it was introduced and it fell away. Now, last year it was introduced again, and there was massive opposition. They tried a range of tactics to try to alter the mandates from provinces to get that bill through. Now, the Traditional Courts Bill is depicted as a way of giving people access to justice that is in accordance with the customs of the people. But in fact, they are making it compulsory for anyone who comes within the jurisdiction of a chief, and that jurisdiction, by the way, is defined the same way as the Bantustans were. Anyone who comes there falls under the compulsory jurisdiction of the chiefs, and they can be fined, and a range of penalties can be applied to them. One of the serious effects is that women cannot be represented in those courts, and the Alliance of Rural Democracy was very instrumental in organizing people to reject that bill. And it lapsed. It wasn't withdrawn, and we've been assured that it will be reintroduced. There's also the very important legislation regarding land rights that I referred to in my last interview, which, while purporting to spread land rights, is not allocating sufficient funds for this, but is also encouraging chiefs to make claims for land on behalf of communities. So it's not certain that that land will actually pass on to the people who are demanding it. There are a lot of problems with these claims, and the problems relate to the way in which the present government is recreating Bantustan-type government, or trying to recreate it in the areas, the rural areas of South Africa, creating two types of citizenship. One type which falls under the common law, and another type which cannot choose and is forced to abide by what is called customary law, but in fact is a very modified version of that, which is disadvantageous for women. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your insights once more. That was Professor Raymond Suttner speaking about politics and elections in South Africa.